Consider this, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I am pleased this week to have Dr. Paul Williams of the UNO Religious Studies program with us, and I have been intrigued as a journalist listening to journalists spew on about why people voted for who they voted for in the presidential election. And the polls and some of the surveying that's been done saying moral values was the big one. There was economy and war in Iraq and a few other things. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. But of course, moral values are fairly complex. And while moral values got a lot of press, as I recall, the figures were only 22% said that was their first consideration. The other considerations like terrorism, the war in Iraq, and the economy were not far behind in terms of their importance, which in my mind reflects the fact that moral values are much more complicated than most of the discussion has suggested so far in the press.
There was, they were alluding oftentimes to the ecumenical Christians because they were the ones that certainly were powered to go out and work for George Bush. You know, work in the field, do a lot of the field work, and it was thought that he is part of. They are part of his conservative core base. So just the fact that they use that term over and over, ecumenical Christians or evangelical Christians or whatever, I meant evangelical. They're not,
yes.
Not necessarily ecumenical, but you know, that kept adding that religious feel to the conversation, and that may not be a bona fide feel.
Well, I think it is, because I think many people's moral values are based in their religious traditions. You're right, the base that the president has relied upon is the evangelical Protestant community in large measure, and they are ecumenical in their own way within a broad range of traditions. Most people, I think, do link their religious faith with their moral values. What puzzled me, and to some extent troubles me about the discussion and about the exit polls, is that most of the moral values that were mentioned have more to do with issues of sexual ethics than with broader issues like war and peace, social justice, what our society does in terms of its relationship to the poorest and weakest members of the society, or the question of just war, which was raised by various people through the course of the election.
By sexual politics, you mean the things that are related in some form to sex, which the gay issue,
right,
which certainly how the timing of that in Massachusetts and the work to throw those issues on the ballot against gay marriages very quickly tend to polarize a little bit. Certainly abortion, which the whole issue begins with sex, and then people's sexual, I guess, the decisions they make after a child is conceived or a fetus is there. And so, am I missing any sexual?
Oh, well, certainly there are others, but gay marriage and abortion seem to be the two principal ones. So, and they have a lot of traction. You know,
they're hot button.
They're hot button issues, certainly.
And people feel extremely strongly and know where they stand on those issues. I mean, there's not issue. For instance, you talk about the safety net and the poor, and I think most people would say that people who are poor and have no other way out, or are, you know, really those that need help, that they're all in favor of a safety net.
Right.
They might disagree on how or how much that safety net is implemented, but they don't see themselves as uncharitable or uncaring about those that, you know, the ones that Christ talked about, the least of our brethren, you know.
Right.
So they don't, you know, they think they are all things, and I'm not criticizing. I'm saying I don't know what I would think about, or I wouldn't tell you what I think about the sexual politics necessarily, but I would say generally I believe, you know, in taking care of people that need taking care of.
And I believe that most of the electorate on both sides of the divide do.
So therefore, I mean, that's not a black and white issue. That
I don't think so.
There are more gray areas in terms of how that's done.
It's an important fundamental issue. I just think that as a rule, it involves much more complex policy considerations than these issues of sexual morality. And frankly, people's eyes tend to glaze over when you talk about the details of policy considerations. What do you do about the less fortunate in our society? Or if you go through the rules regarding just war. That's a complex technical analysis within at least the Roman Catholic tradition. And not everyone can track as readily. But sex, everyone can identify at one level in one way or another with issues of sexuality.
So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us down the road in terms of carrying on a national discussion about all of these issues, both the sexual politics issues and the social justice issues and just war? There seemed to be a rather divisiveness on the issue of war. You know, it was just or it was unjust. And maybe there were a few at the end that, you know, used that as their decision. Which way do I go on that? But they defined themselves early. I think those voters that felt very strongly about that.
Perhaps, but whether they went through the calculus of what constitutes a just war or not.
Because it takes more.
It takes more.
It takes more. Even the issue of
effort.
the environment, which many people consider a moral value. You know, how we treat our environment is going to affect how people are treated by the environment itself down the road. So they think that is a moral issue, and that's one that really glazes you over when you start talking about the options. So how do we discuss these things? We've almost pitted Christians against Christians in some respects.
In some respects. And it's interesting that the president was able to draw on these key issues that are clearly of central concern for him about abortion and gay marriage and related issues. He was able to draw on a very specific constituency that was very anxious about that. One of the interesting results of the exit polls is that he was able to increase his support among a number of groups that traditionally vote more Democratic. For example, the Roman Catholic vote began to shift in his direction, not entirely, but kind of like the phenomenon of the Reagan Democrats a couple of decades ago. We now have Bush Roman Catholics, not evangelical Protestants, folks who are concerned about social justice issues, as the church at large is, but who were just deeply concerned about the issue of abortion. And that was a compelling issue for them. It doesn't mean that the issues of the war in Iraq or the economy or other concerns are going to go away, though. They will continue to appear in the press and in the policy debates.
Even if our government and the Supreme Court and the new appointees, if the Supreme Court took an about-face on Roe versus Wade, and if they forbade gay marriage in every state, that could be done to make those people happy on those social, moral issues by the stroke of a pen or a decision. Those other ones, as you said, are more complex. Assuming, I mean, there is no nirvana for them. For those that are anti-abortion, there is a nirvana that either Supreme Court's going to change it or, you know, some stroke of a pen or a decision is going to change it. Not so with the other ones.
I don't think so.
So how does one that cares about all those issues one way or another steer the conversation to those more complex issues from either just a political or a religious point of view, a moral point of view, or all of the above?
Partly you keep talking, and you keep talking with each other, and hopefully people talk honestly and don't engage in the kind of typical maneuvers that happen during elections, where people try to disparage other person's characters and suggest that, you know, one candidate A is good and candidate B is bad, but actually engage in an honest discussion of the nature of the issues, the breadth of the issues, the complexity of the issues, because elections tend to simplify very complex moral and public policy issues.
Well, the genius,
and that's to our detriment.
Yeah, and the genius of the Bush campaign, I mean, Karl Rove is a genius. He looked at the demographics. He said what were the issues. The issues that he found that could be hot button issues were compatible with Bush's personal beliefs, and they said them over and over and over again, with the urgency and importance that those were really the only issues.
Right.
So they
Right.
set the agenda. They set the table.
And they won, fair and square.
And he was an incumbent too, which I
Which
think
helps. But one thing to remember, the talk about a mandate and what that means. The president spoke about, because of this election, he felt he had a mandate. I was puzzling over this. I know we say if 55%, or whatever the number is, if 55% of the electorate votes for candidate A, that's a landslide. But what we know is that 45% or more voted very specifically, intentionally, conscientiously against the one who ended up winning. So we have a fairly powerful divide, maybe not a deep cleavage within the American society, and I think there's room for overlap, room for conversation, and a lot of cross-cutting factors. But to suggest that this 51 to 55% majority ought to control all future policy issues, I think is extraordinarily problematic. To simply ignore the very deep and real concerns of voters who did come out not necessarily for Kerry, but against Bush. And we know that was a strong factor that's reflected very clearly in the exit polls.
So we have a situation where there is certainly divisiveness in some areas, and I think it's very strong. But an election tends to make you dwell on your differences rather than
Right.
what you have in common. And I really believe that the lack of common ground discussion is amazing. Maybe I'm an idealist. I know I am. Do you know what I mean? We need to raise the level of public discussion
Right.
to talk about, okay, first, what can we agree on? I mean, that's how you sit down and you solve
Right.
problems. I'm sure when you're trying to decide how to spend the budget in your department and you don't have as much money as you want, you first find
There's
areas
never
that you
enough money.
you agree on. What is
Yeah.
vitally important?
Right. Set priorities.
And energy, for instance, is a vitally important thing. Our whole energy policy. And we can all agree that we want to be more independent from the Middle East. And I guess that's how you do it. But I mean, if we could just state what we do stand for, as opposed to what we don't.
And if all the talk of unity that often happens after elections were actually real. Now,
I mean, sincere?
Sincere. And, you know, I generally take people at face value until they prove otherwise. When people get up and say, now the nation needs to reunify, if that is seriously intended, then that means people who honestly differ about issues ought to listen to each other. That's, as you suggested, perhaps an idealistic perspective, but that is the only way to make progress with intractable issues, or seemingly intractable issues.
The news media is certainly, by its very nature, you know, we go through journalism schools and we say you present both sides. What has happened now, primarily on news networks, is that you have people from different opinions, but they tend not to be both sides of their opinion. They're trying to throw barbs at the other side more than they are just trying to state their opinion.
Right.
Is that good or bad? I don't know, but I see that more and more. It's throwing the barbs as opposed to just, this is what I stand for and why. And so therefore, it's not a very charitable approach.
The discussion becomes more contentious.
My mother
Yeah.
doesn't like that.
You're right, right.
So,
Nor do I. And really, the only real way to get past some of these issues is for people who truly disagree with each other, honestly disagree with each other, be able to sit down and talk. And we need to have multiple fora for that. That doesn't just happen between the White House and Congress. That happens obviously in people's churches, it happens in people's homes, and it ought to happen in places like the State University.
it also requires a thing called leadership. And I'm not making an editorial comment. I just wonder if the art of leadership and personal diplomacy is dwindling. You know, true leadership. And I can't say that there were more leaders 10 years ago than there were. But let's take an example on the issue of immigration. And we had Senator Chuck Hagel from our very own state and Senator Daschle, who was not reelected. But they came up with at least the beginnings of a plan to solve a problem that is long overdue.
Right.
So you need people to talk to one another that can find that common ground. And obviously they did.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know what's going to happen to that bill. I think something will happen. It has to happen on that issue. But I love it when I see that. When the Social Security Blue Ribbon Panel had Senator Simpson from Wyoming, a grand Republican, a wonderful man, and Bob Kerrey agreeing. You know, I mean, there is room, and I'm impressed, whether I agree with the outcome or not, when this happens.
And a lot of that has been done. People are afraid that less of that will happen in the future, and we just have to wait and see. The people who control, whether it's the committees in Congress or run the White House, need to exhibit their concern for the larger society, for common ground, as you made reference to, and demonstrate that they have the capacity to extend the conversation beyond the contentious and largely ideological debates that come out during the elections.
Which ideological sort of brings us back sort of to the moral values. I mean, because in some cases we're talking about ideological things. So there's nothing wrong with stating things in terms of moral values. I don't think that's it. It's just that, you know, there's my moral values and yours are wrong, and there's my moral values and yours are wrong. Against ecology, the social justice, there's probably more to agree on than disagree on.
Probably so, but what people need to learn how to do is not just say what their position is, but articulate or explain why they hold that position, what other values are at stake. Why would we be concerned about the environment? You mentioned that a couple of times. You know, not only for our sake, but also for the sake of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We need to keep the bigger picture in mind when we engage these discussions. And I think there's a tendency just to boil it down to, are you going to vote A or B? You know, yes or no? And pretend that things really are black and white, when in fact they are not. The issues are much more complex than political rhetoric often leads us to believe.
And there's so much of, if you ain't for us, you're against us. And I just find very few people I really feel that way with. You know, I mean, very few people on the face of the earth that I've met, and I've only met a few really. But it doesn't have to be that way.
I don't think so. A couple of years ago, I taught a course on ethics for the religious studies program here, and we tackled fundamental issues: abortion, suicide, war and peace, a variety of others as well. And there were people in the class, 20 students, who had profoundly different opinions, some very well thought out, some poorly thought out. And through the course of the semester, we worked at the issue of how do we engage in a respectful dialogue that doesn't always lead to a common solution, but at least allows us to continue to speak with each other and to show respect for each other. And if we can maintain the discourse at that level, I still have some hope. But if the discourse only falls down to the blame game, to the contention, to the reducing complex issues to simple formula, that's a great concern.
Well, you've mentioned to me before, and you've mentioned publicly, that you see the university as sort of a microcosm. Granted, the age skews a little lower, but on this campus, not necessarily.
Right. Depends on the class.
Right. So in your little microcosm, in your little laboratory here of studying, do you find, as you did in that class, when they left, did they feel better about each other as well as how they came to a belief?
I think two things happened that I was grateful to see. One, they could see that people with whom they disagreed were real, honest, sincere individuals. The other thing was, in the dialogue, they were able to discover more clearly what their own opinions are.
And where they came from,
and
how
where
they
came
formed them.
And I don't see my task in the classroom as persuading students to believe this or that thing, But I think it's important that they be able to explain what they believe and to explain it in clear terms that could be part of a public discussion. And I saw that happen. And so, when I see that, I think, good. There's
Maybe,
hope.
Perhaps. Okay, so another thing that, you work on a campus that we are seeing a great diversity in the student body here. We have a good number of foreign students. So you've got a great deal of, or a growing number of Muslim
Yes.
students.
Yes.
We have, I'm sure a certain percentage of Jewish students. I don't know if they come through your curriculum at all, but you start throwing those things into the mix, and not just the evangelical versus the mainline Protestants, and where do the Catholics fit in there, depends on the election. And
Right.
how does this all playing out, the more
Well,
diversity of religion?
We do get students from a wide range of religious traditions. I teach the Introduction to Islam, and I have Muslim students in the class. I also have conservative evangelical Protestants, Roman Catholics, and students who are uncommitted.
Not firm in anything yet.
None of the above. And what I find is that although the press often reflects concerns about either hostility toward Muslims or profound misunderstandings of the Muslim tradition, within the context of that class, with people with widely varying theological commitments, nonetheless, we're able to have civil discourse, achieve some degree of understanding of what the tradition of Islam is all about. And I've had students, whether conservative, Christian, or Muslim students, come out of the class grateful for the opportunity to learn more, to have some real facts and honest information at their disposal. And that's what we try to provide, a forum within which we can discuss very difficult, sometimes delicate issues, but yet continue to respect each other as persons.
I mentioned immigration earlier. A couple of factors here might, the issue of moral values, or even crossing into religious values, may be at play here. Number one, you have a large number of Hispanics, which are traditionally Roman Catholic, but they're conservative Roman Catholic if you want to take into the issues of sexuality, and even the place of women sometimes in their culture. So I see, and it's clear that both parties are trying to figure out how to appeal to them. Because ultimately many of them are going to become citizens. I don't know how it's going to happen or what bill is going to pass, but it's going to happen. Do you find that interesting at all? Certainly the Republicans have been courting the Hispanic vote.
Of course.
It goes back to the Cuban Americans, which always voted Republican.
Oh, of course, it's fascinating. Do I have any comments or thoughts about it? Not particularly.
Are you going to enjoy watching this play out, I guess?
Oh, what I enjoy watching is we're seeing an America that is becoming increasingly diverse, ethnically, religiously, in a wide variety of ways. And if the promise of democracy and freedom is that we can live in a society with people with whom we disagree and nonetheless live in civil society and with civility, if that's going to play itself out, we're going to have a test case in our lives in the next decade and the next few decades. And so it's, of course, absolutely fascinating to watch. I sometimes watch it with a little anxiety. After 9/11, we saw some attacks on people who appeared to be Muslim. That
You're
makes me
browner than the average person.
That makes me very nervous because I remember the Ku Klux Klan, and I remember some of the violent activities against people of ethnic and racial minorities that have gone on in this country historically. And so I'm anxious about the increasing diversity, but I also think it's a rich opportunity for us to learn what democracy and freedom really mean.
I am increasingly hearing, I don't know if it's moving geographically north, south, east, or west, but I'm increasingly hearing two things around my environment here. There are a number of people who are thrilled by the change in culture that's coming with the influx of Hispanics. There are others that are just angry and resentful as heck that they will probably be made citizens. They're coming, and they're even calling it the Reconquista in many cases, the reconquest in reverse.
Yeah.
I think there is a potential for a moral, if not religious, kind of fight over how we approach that.
Numerous complex issues, and as you suggested, with the increasing appeal that the president has been able to make to Latino communities, we're seeing that the issues are not as cut and dry. It used to be Latinos seemed to be predominantly, although Roman Catholic and somewhat conservative socially, predominantly voting Democratic. Well, it's not that cut and dry. They're voting Republican, not overwhelmingly, but increasingly. I think we're going to see other cross-cutting factors that I hope will put off the possibility of a simple confrontation between current Americans and incoming future Americans. It would be very unfortunate if we ended up having that kind of ethnic conflict based simply on country of origin. We've done it before in this country, and I would be afraid to see that happen. I think everybody here is an immigrant, and except perhaps for our Native American brothers and sisters. But the rest of us have no particular claim other than that we got here before you did.
And then we happen to be born to someone that immigrated or to someone in the line of immigrants.
Exactly, and we may be grateful to our grandparents or great-great-grandparents for coming over here. I think if we're honest with ourselves and we look around and we understand why people want to come here, there are rich opportunities, and it's one that has served us well. Ought it not to also serve others?
We have less than a minute left, but there's all sorts of issues we could go into in terms of jobs and job displacement and values and moralities there. But I want to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Lots of food for thought and lots of optimism. Dr. Paul Williams with the Religious Studies Department at UNO, thank you. And thank you for joining us on Consider This.
To view this edition of Consider This or past programs, visit our website at unotv.unomaha.edu. For comments or questions, call 402-554-2516 during regular business hours. Consider This is a production of UNO Television.